What would you do if the very system meant to protect you turned against you? One night, Judge Ezra Langston was pulled over without cause, humiliated, and handcuffed in front of his own home. But what seemed like a simple case of racial profiling quickly unraveled into something much darker. A corrupt web of power, crime, and deception buried deep within Baltimore's justice system. As Ezra fights back, he faces a dangerous question. Can one man truly bring down a system built to silence him? Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The night air was thick with the scent of wet pavement and distant sirens as Ezra Langston pulled his car into the main road leading out of downtown Baltimore. He had just finished presiding over a tense court session, a case involving a police officer accused of excessive force. The verdict wasn't due for another few days, but the weight of it already pressed on him. These cases were never simple. They carried consequences, not just for the people in the courtroom, but for the entire city. He loosened his tie as he drove, allowing himself a rare moment of solitude. The streets were quiet, lined with rows of aging streetlights that cast long shadows over the cracked sidewalks. He glanced at the clock. 9:47 p.m. Willow Heights wasn't far now, just a few more turns. Home meant peace, a respite from the world's chaos. At least it should have. Then out of nowhere, flashing red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. He exhaled slowly, pulling the car to the curb, already feeling the familiar frustration settling in his chest. Not again. This wasn't the first time he had been stopped for no reason. It was, however, the first time in years. He reached for his wallet, preparing to go through the same routine he had seen play out too many times before. Two officers approached, one a younger man with dark hair and tense shoulders, the other a tall, broad-shouldered man with a hardened face that spoke of years spent patrolling the streets. Ezra watched as they exchanged a glance before the older one, Lieutenant Rick Henshaw, tapped on the window. "License and registration." Ezra complied, handing them over without a word. Henshaw studied the documents longer than necessary, his eyes flicking between Ezra and the papers as if searching for an inconsistency. "This your car?" His voice carried a sharp edge, laced with something just beneath the surface. A challenge. Ezra met his gaze evenly. "It is." The younger officer, Noah Velasquez, shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable. "Where are you headed tonight?" Henshaw continued, his fingers tapping against the roof of the car. "Home," Ezra replied, keeping his voice level. "I'd ask why you pulled me over, but I have a feeling I won't get an answer." Henshaw smirked. "Just routine, sir. You understand, this is a nice car. Expensive." He let the words hang. "Not a lot of folks around here drive something like this." Ezra's jaw tightened. He'd heard the coded language before. He exhaled slowly, refusing to rise to the bait. "Stay calm, stay controlled." Then, without warning, Henshaw gestured to Velasquez. "Step out of the vehicle." Ezra didn't move. "Excuse me?" "Step out," Henshaw repeated, voice colder this time. A flicker of hesitation crossed Velasquez's face, but he stayed silent, waiting for Ezra to comply. Ezra took a breath, his pulse steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Make them justify this. Don't give them an excuse." He unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door, stepping onto the pavement with measured calm. The air outside was cool, but his skin burned with frustration. Henshaw wasted no time. He patted Ezra down, the motion unnecessarily firm, too quick to be procedural. A few feet away, a small group of bystanders had gathered. Neighbors, strangers, people who had seen this too many times before. And then, without preamble, Henshaw reached for his cuffs. "What exactly am I being detained for?" Ezra's voice remained steady, but his eyes were sharp. Henshaw barely looked at him. Click. The cuffs locked around his wrists. The streetlights above cast long shadows on the pavement as murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Someone pulled out a phone, then another. "Is this really necessary?" Velasquez finally spoke, his voice uncertain. Henshaw shot him a look. "Do your job, officer." That was when Ezra caught a glimpse of her, Ruby Thompson, his elderly neighbor, standing on her porch with a furrowed brow. She was shaking her head, disbelief written across her features. "This is wrong," she said, her voice clear despite the distance. "Everyone here knows this man. He's a judge." At her words, a flicker of confusion crossed Velasquez's face. Then finally he looked at the name on the ID. His lips parted slightly as realization dawned. Henshaw too glanced down at the card. His expression barely changed, but Ezra caught the tightening of his grip, the flicker of tension in his jaw. Seconds passed. Then with a sharp exhale, Henshaw unlocked the cuffs. "Must be some mix-up," he muttered, stepping back as if the situation hadn't escalated under his watch. "You're free to go." Ezra rubbed his wrists, feeling the sting of cold metal still lingering. He could have argued. He could have demanded an explanation. But in that moment, he chose silence. Instead, he met Henshaw's eyes, cold, unrepentant. Then he turned without another word and walked back to his car. The cameras were still rolling. The murmurs continued. Ezra sat behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt something else. Something deeper. Something unresolved. His phone buzzed. A call. Warren Patel. He picked up. "You saw the video, didn't you?" Ezra asked, voice tired. "I did," Warren said. There was something in his tone. Something heavier than just concern. Ezra leaned his head back against the seat. "Go ahead. Say it." Warren exhaled. Then with deliberate weight he said, "This isn't just about race, Ezra. It's bigger than that. I found something, and you need to see it." The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting faint lines across Ezra's bedroom. He hadn't slept much. The events of the previous night played on a loop in his mind. The flashing lights, the firm grip of the handcuffs, the cold stare of Lieutenant Henshaw. He had been through a lot in his career, but something about this felt different. His phone buzzed incessantly on the nightstand. He finally reached for it, expecting another message from Warren, but instead the screen was filled with news alerts. His name was everywhere. Prominent federal judge wrongfully detained by Baltimore police. Viral video sparks. Outrage, Judge Ezra Langston, handcuffed without cause. Ezra scrolled through the articles, the weight in his chest growing heavier with each headline. Social media was ablaze with opinions, some outraged, some dismissive. The usual narratives played out in the comment sections, accusations of racial profiling, calls for justice, and, inevitably, voices defending the officers involved. A sharp knock at the door pulled him out of his thoughts. When he opened it, his daughter Kendra Langston stood there, phone in hand, her expression tight with frustration. "Dad, we need to talk." He sighed, stepping aside to let her in. "I assume you've seen the news?" "I've seen the news, I've seen the video, and I've seen the response," she said, setting her bag down with more force than necessary. "The police department put out a statement a few minutes ago. An unfortunate misunderstanding is what they're calling it." Ezra clenched his jaw. He should have expected as much. Kendra paced the living room, her energy barely contained. "This is bigger than just a bad traffic stop. People are talking. Civil rights groups are demanding an investigation. And She hesitated, then met his gaze. "I want to write about it." Ezra exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. "Kendra, I don't want to become the center of this." She frowned. "You already are. You didn't ask for it, but that doesn't change the fact that people are watching, and they're waiting to see what you do next." He sank onto the couch, his exhaustion catching up with him. "I'm a judge, Kendra, not an activist." "You're a judge who just got thrown against his own car and cuffed like a criminal," she shot back. "What happened to you is exactly why this system needs to be exposed." Before he could respond, another knock came at the door. This time, it was Warren Patel. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Warren said as he stepped inside. He carried a folder under one arm and an expression that told Ezra he hadn't slept much either. "I assume you have something for me?" Ezra asked, gesturing toward the folder. Warren nodded, setting it on the coffee table. "I started digging last night. What happened to you isn't just a random act of misconduct. There's a pattern here. Henshaw isn't just another bad cop. He's part of something much bigger." Ezra exchanged a glance with Kendra before flipping open the folder. The first thing he saw was a list of names. Some had red marks beside them. Others had notes scribbled in the margins. "What is this?" he asked. Warren leaned forward, lowering his voice. These are people who have been unlawfully detained by officers under Henshaw's command. Some were charged with crimes they didn't commit. Others just disappeared from the system. And then there's the money. Ezra's eyes narrowed. What money? Warren tapped a separate sheet of paper. A series of unexplained financial transactions tied to officers in his precinct. Suspicious payouts. Cash deposits with no clear source. And the kicker? Henshaw has direct connections to a known criminal organization. The same one that has its hands in local politics, business deals, and apparently law enforcement. Ezra felt a chill run down his spine. Kendra, now completely absorbed in the documents, muttered, "This isn't just corruption. This is systemic." Ezra closed the folder and exhaled. "So what do we do with this?" Warren sat back, watching him carefully. "That's up to you, Ezra. But I think you already know the answer." He did. The anger from the night before was still there, simmering beneath the surface. But now it wasn't just about him. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a machine, and it had been operating unchecked for too long. For the first time since the incident, Ezra felt something sharper than frustration. Resolve. Baltimore's morning sun cast sharp shadows over the precinct as news vans lined the curb, their satellite dishes aimed toward the sky. Reporters huddled together, adjusting their microphones, fixing their hair, making sure they were ready when the cameras rolled. The air buzzed with anticipation. This wasn't just another press conference. At exactly 9 a.m., Lieutenant Rick Henshaw stepped up to the podium, the insignia on his uniform gleaming under the harsh light. He stood tall, shoulders squared, expression firm, every bit the composed officer in control. Last night's incident involving Judge Ezra Langston was an unfortunate misunderstanding, he announced, voice measured, carefully neutral. At no point was there any racial bias or misconduct from my officers. We deeply regret any confusion this may have caused, but I assure you, the Baltimore Police Department remains committed to serving this community with integrity. Cameras flashed, pens scratched against notepads. Some reporters nodded, buying into the polished response. Others exchanged looks, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Does he really expect us to believe this? Across town in his office, Ezra Langston watched the live broadcast, the words pressing against his skull like a dull, persistent ache. A misunderstanding. That was what they were calling it. Being shoved against his car? A misunderstanding. Being handcuffed in front of his neighbors? A misunderstanding. Being treated like a criminal for daring to drive home? A misunderstanding. No apology. No accountability. Ezra exhaled sharply and turned off the television. The weight of it all settled into his bones, heavier than before. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Warren Patel stepped in, not bothering with pleasantries, and tossed a thick manila folder onto Ezra's desk. "You're going to want to see this," Warren muttered, dropping into the chair across from him. Ezra opened the folder. Reports, statements, mugshots, page after page of unlawful arrests, fabricated charges, routine harassment, all carried out by officers under Henshaw's command. A pattern, not an accident. Ezra's fingers hovered over a particular case. Javier Morales, 19 years old. Stopped for a broken taillight, charged with illegal possession of a firearm. No priors. The so-called weapon never recovered. And yet, still in jail, awaiting trial. He closed his eyes for a moment. "Where did you get this?" Warren leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Someone inside. They're scared, but they're done looking the other way." Ezra rubbed his temple, scanning the names. Morales wasn't alone. There were dozens like him. "This isn't just about me," Ezra muttered. "No," Warren said, "and we're only scratching the surface." Before Ezra could respond, his office phone rang. "This is Langston." A pause, then a voice, hesitant, uncertain. "Judge Langston, my name is Lewis Carter. I think you know my brother, Darius." Ezra sat up straighter. He knew the name. Darius Carter, a community activist. Loud, fearless, always speaking out against police brutality. Until 3 months ago. Until he vanished. "They took him," Luis said, his voice shaking. "He spoke out, and they made him disappear. I have proof, but I need to be careful. Ezra's grip on the phone tightened. "Meet me," he said. "Somewhere safe." They met in a small, rundown diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where people came to be forgotten. Lewis Carter was young, early 20s, with tired eyes and restless fingers. He glanced around the room before sliding a flash drive across the table. "This has everything," he whispered. "Bank records, surveillance footage, internal memos. They framed my brother just like they've done to so many others." Ezra plugged the drive into his laptop. It was all there. Wire transfers, confidential reports, direct ties between Henshaw's officers and a known criminal syndicate. A cold realization settled in Ezra's gut. This wasn't just a bad precinct. This was an entire system built to protect itself. He closed the laptop, exhaling slowly. His decision was made. "They won't let this slide," Lewis warned. "If you go public, they'll come after you." Ezra met his gaze. His voice was steady when he spoke. "Then let them." By morning, the city felt different. Ezra didn't need to turn on the news. He could feel it. The air was heavier. The conversations were quieter, but they lasted longer. The streets weren't just filled with cars and commuters anymore. There was something else, something humming beneath the surface. Something was shifting. It was everywhere. Kendra's article had done exactly what it was meant to do. Front page, bold, unapologetic, impossible to ignore. She hadn't just hinted at corruption. She hadn't danced around it. She named names. She published the financial records. She exposed every dark corner they tried to keep hidden. No more whispers, no more rumors. Now it was black and white. And just like that, Baltimore exploded. It started small. A few people gathered outside the Baltimore Police Department, holding signs, standing together in clusters. By midday, those clusters had turned into hundreds. People chanting, marching, demanding answers. By afternoon, reporters had taken over City Hall. Microphones were shoved into the faces of officials who had spent weeks dodging questions. They had nothing to say now. The Department of Justice had no choice. Before noon, an official inquiry was announced. By sunset, the mayor's office was in full-blown crisis mode. Ezra stood by his office window, coffee in hand, watching the city move. The weight of it settled deep in his chest. This was what they had been fighting for. But he knew better than to celebrate, because when powerful people are threatened, they don't just sit back and let it happen. The envelope was just sitting there, right in the middle of Ezra's desk, standing out against the neat stacks of legal briefs and case files. No return address, no postage, just his name, Ezra Langston, scrawled in uneven black ink. He didn't need to open it to know what it was, but he did anyway. He slid his finger under the flap, peeled it open, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The message was short, typed in plain font, without a signature or anything personal. "Stop now if you want to live." Ezra stared at it for a moment, fingers tightening around the edges. He had been expecting this. When you pushed against power, power pushed back. But there was something about the cold simplicity of the message that made his skin crawl. No threats of lawsuits, no vague legal warnings. Just that one sentence. A knock at the door pulled him back. Kendra. She stepped in, holding her phone up. "You need to see this," she said, her voice clipped, her face pale. Ezra took the phone from her hands. The image was grainy, taken under dim streetlights, but the message was clear. Her car, tires slashed, windshield shattered, spray painted in red across the hood. "Stay out of it." Ezra clenched his jaw. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Kendra said, but her voice wavered, just for a second. "They did it while I was inside grabbing coffee. I was gone maybe 5 minutes." Ezra shut his eyes briefly, pushing down the anger threatening to rise. "Did you call the police?" he asked. Kendra let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You mean the same police department we're exposing for corruption?" "No, Dad, I didn't." Ezra exhaled, setting the phone down. "I'll handle it." Before she could argue, his office phone rang. He hesitated, then picked up. "You really have a way of kicking a hornet's nest," Warren Patel's voice came through the line. Ezra didn't even bother with pleasantries. "I assume you've heard." "Of course I have," Warren said. "And I'm telling you now, this isn't a game. These people are dangerous." A pause. "Maybe it's time to step back." Ezra stared at the note on his desk. You know I can't do that. Warren sighed, the frustration evident in his tone. Then at least be smart about it. We need to build this case airtight before we move forward. If we don't have enough, they'll bury it, and us, with it. Ezra leaned back, rubbing his temple. How much do we have? Enough to raise hell, Warren admitted, but maybe not enough to win in court. We need more, and we need someone on the inside willing to testify. Ezra hesitated. He knew exactly who that someone was. Noah Velasquez sat across from Ezra in a rundown diner on the edge of the city, the kind of place where nobody asked questions. The yellowed light above flickered every few seconds, casting uneasy shadows over the cracked vinyl booth. His hands were wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, but he hadn't taken a single sip. He looked tired, not the kind of tired that came from missing a few nights of sleep, but the kind that settled into a man's bones, the kind that came from spending too many nights staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. Ezra didn't waste time. You know why I asked you here, he said, his voice even, controlled. Noah nodded but kept his eyes on the table. You want me to testify? I need you to testify, Ezra corrected. You've seen the records. You know what's happening inside that department. You know what Henshaw is capable of. Noah finally looked up, his expression guarded. If I go against them, I lose everything. Ezra leaned in, resting his elbows on the table. His voice softened, but there was no less weight behind it. You're already losing, Noah. Every time you stand by and let this happen, you lose. He let the words hang in the air. You signed up to protect people, to serve justice. Tell me, does that still mean something to you? Noah swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the mug. It does. Ezra nodded, watching him carefully. Then prove it. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the hum of the old diner radio in the background. Noah exhaled, a slow, measured breath. When he looked back at Ezra, there was something new in his expression, something that looked like resolve. I'll do it. Ezra sat back, nodding slowly. Then we do this together. Because now, there was no turning back. The city felt different. There was a tension in the air, something heavy, something that hummed just beneath the surface. It wasn't loud, not yet, but Ezra could feel it, a quiet, creeping resistance. This wasn't just about one corrupt cop. It wasn't about Rick Henshaw or even the mayor. This was a machine, well-oiled, deeply entrenched, and the harder Ezra pushed, the harder it pushed back. Kendra stormed into his office without knocking, her phone clenched in one hand, her bag slung over her shoulder like she'd just come straight from the newsroom. They're trying to shut me down, she said, dropping into the chair across from him. Ezra set his pen down. Who? The city, the higher-ups. She rubbed her temples, frustration radiating off of her. My editor called me in this morning, said they've been advised to back off. Ezra leaned back, exhaling slowly. What exactly does that mean? It means, she snapped, that the mayor's office has been leaning on the paper, that we've done enough reporting on police corruption, that we should let the system work. She scoffed, like that's ever worked before. Ezra studied her. They're scared. They should be, Kendra shot back. Then she sighed, shaking her head. But instead of fixing the problem, they're trying to bury it. Ezra tapped his fingers against the desk. So what now? She met his gaze. We keep going. Ezra nodded. Good. A small smile tugged at her lips. Because I just got another lead. She pulled out her phone, swiping to a message. A man named Luis Carter reached out to me. His brother, Darius Carter, he's been missing for months, and he says he knows why. Ezra's expression darkened. Did he tell you anything? No, she said. He wants to meet. Before Ezra could respond, the office door swung open. Warren Patel stepped inside, looking grim, a newspaper folded under his arm. Without a word, he tossed it onto the desk. Ezra unfolded it. Baltimore judge stirs political controversy amidst police probe. The article was a clear smear piece, painting him as a reckless agitator, someone using his influence to incite unrest rather than uphold the law. They're not just playing defense anymore, Warren muttered. They're coming after you. Ezra clenched his jaw but didn't look up. Let them. Noah Velasquez had spent weeks pretending he could ignore it. He told himself it wasn't his fight, told himself he needed this job, told himself he couldn't change anything anyway. And for a while, that was enough to keep his head down, enough to let him walk past the locker room conversations, the knowing smirks, the hush money envelopes that passed from hand to hand like it was just another part of the job. But then he'd seen the files, real names, real people, real lives destroyed. Arrests that never should have happened. Money funneled from drug traffickers and gang leaders straight into department accounts. Bribes paid to keep some criminals safe while others were tossed to the wolves. He could have looked away, could have pretended, just like everyone else, that this was how the system worked. But he didn't. That night, Noah sat alone in his car, parked just outside the precinct. The glow of the streetlights cast long shadows over the dashboard. His hands rested on the steering wheel, unmoving. If he went inside now, if he walked through those doors, he'd be one of them again. If he did what he was about to do, he'd never be able to go back. He pulled out a USB drive from his pocket. His fingers hovered over the laptop's keyboard for just a second before he plugged it in. And then he copied everything: internal reports, financial records, misconduct complaints, everything. The truth, the proof, all of it. When the transfer bar hit 100%, he sat back staring at the screen. His chest felt tight. His hands felt clammy. He was about to set a fire he couldn't put out. He pulled out his phone. He dialed. When Ezra Langston picked up, Noah didn't hesitate. "I'm in." Ezra and Warren met him at a private office space, the kind of place where people handled business they didn't want connected to them. Noah slid the USB drive across the table. Ezra plugged it into his laptop, his eyes scanning the files. What he saw made his stomach turn. Bribes, falsified evidence, arrests ordered by higher-ups to protect certain figures in the city's political landscape. "This is what we needed," Warren murmured. Ezra nodded. "We take this to the DOJ." But the next morning, everything changed. Ezra stood in his kitchen, one hand gripping the coffee pot, the other rubbing his tired eyes. He hadn't slept much, hadn't really slept at all, to be honest. His mind had been running in circles, replaying the past few weeks like a broken record. The coffee dripped into his mug, dark and steaming, but before he could take a sip, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen. Kendra. A bad feeling settled in his gut before he even picked up. "Yeah?" Her voice came fast, breathless, shaking. "They arrested Noah." Ezra's blood ran cold. He straightened, gripping the edge of the counter. "What?" "They're charging him with falsifying police records." Her words tumbled out, frantic. "Dad, it's a setup." Ezra squeezed his eyes shut for a second, forcing himself to stay calm. His knuckles whitened against the counter. He knew exactly what this was. It wasn't about Noah. This was a message. They weren't just silencing a whistleblower. They were warning him. The room was packed. Reporters squeezed together, some balancing notebooks on their knees, others holding up microphones, waiting for the moment to pounce. The hum of conversation filled the air, a nervous energy vibrating through the space. Ezra Langston stood at the podium, steady but aware of the weight pressing down on him. The flashes from the cameras were relentless, like lightning striking over and over. Behind him, Kendra stood with her arms crossed, her face unreadable, while Warren loomed close, his expression tense. The city wanted answers. The country wanted a fight. Ezra took a slow breath, adjusted the microphone, and let his gaze travel across the faces before him. He wasn't here to entertain. He wasn't here to defend himself. He was here to tell the truth. "The evidence we have gathered does not just suggest misconduct," he said, his voice carrying through the room. "It confirms corruption at the highest levels of law enforcement in Baltimore." The hum died instantly. A heavy silence filled the space. He continued, his tone unwavering. "For years, officers under Lieutenant Rick Henshaw's command have engaged in false arrests, fabricated charges, and violent abuse. These actions were not random. They were deliberate. They were designed to protect powerful individuals while terrorizing those without power." A few reporters exchanged glances. Pens scratched against notebooks. Ezra could feel the shift, like storm clouds rolling in, the weight of something big about to break. "And this corruption doesn't end with Henshaw," Ezra went on. We have documented proof that funds were funneled from criminal enterprises into police accounts, a system designed to keep certain criminals safe while innocent people suffered. The tension thickened. Some reporters had their phones out, live streaming the moment. Others were already whispering to colleagues, formulating headlines in real time. Ezra held up a flash drive. Everything on here will be turned over to the Department of Justice and released to the press. The room exploded. Judge Langston, are you saying the mayor's office was involved? What about the police chief? Did he know? Do you fear retaliation? Ezra raised his hand, silencing the chaos. I am not afraid, he said simply, because fear is how corruption thrives. It counts on good people staying quiet. It relies on us looking the other way. But we're done looking away. The shouting grew louder, the flashes of cameras blinding, the urgency in the room reaching a fever pitch. Ezra stepped back. The fire had been lit. Hours later, he sat in his office, exhaustion creeping in. The adrenaline from the press conference had worn off, leaving behind the reality of what he had just done. Kendra paced beside his desk, her phone in hand, scrolling through updates. It's everywhere, she muttered. DOJ just announced a formal investigation. The mayor's on the defensive. Henshaw hasn't made a statement yet, but you can bet he's losing his mind right now. Ezra leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Good. But Warren didn't look relieved. He stood near the window, arms crossed, staring out into the night like he was expecting something to go wrong. There's something you should know, Warren said finally. Ezra frowned. What is it? Warren walked over and tossed an unmarked envelope onto the desk. This was delivered to my office today. No return address. No postage. Ezra hesitated, then picked it up. The paper inside was crisp, typed, and to the point. Drown the fire, Langston, or we'll drown you. He exhaled sharply, gripping the note tighter. The familiar weight of a threat. He had expected this. He had seen it coming. But it still sent a slow, simmering anger through him. They won't stop, Warren said quietly. Not now. As if on cue, Kendra's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Then her face went pale. Dad, she whispered, someone broke into your house. Ezra's entire body went rigid. What? Neighbors called the police, Kendra said, her voice tight. The door was wide open. Nothing was taken, just ransacked. Ezra's grip on the note tightened. A message. They weren't being subtle anymore. They were making it clear. He looked up at Warren, then at Kendra. They had walked into a storm, and the storm was far from over. Ezra wasn't asleep when the email arrived. Lately, sleep had been a distant memory, something he barely remembered how to do. Even when he closed his eyes, his mind wouldn't let him rest. Every choice, every risk, every threat, it all sat heavy on his chest. Noah in jail, Kendra being targeted, and the feeling that no matter how hard he pushed, the system wasn't budging. So when his phone buzzed at 2:14 a.m., he was already awake. The screen glowed in the dark. No sender, no signature, just a subject line. Final piece. Ezra hesitated just for a second, then clicked. The message was short. This is what you need. Do what you must. Attached was a single file, an audio recording. Ezra exhaled slowly. His thumb hovered over the play button. Then he pressed it. For a moment, just static. Then a voice. Rick Henshaw. Listen, Holloway, the money's got to come from somewhere. The department's bleeding cash, and these guys pay well. We let them move product, we get a cut. Simple. Ezra's stomach twisted. Then another voice. Mayor Kevin Holloway. I don't care how you do it, just keep it quiet. No more bodies showing up where they shouldn't. We can't afford another scandal. Silence, then the faint sound of ice clinking in a glass before the file cut off. Ezra sat there gripping the phone. This was it. The final piece. Undeniable proof. Henshaw and Holloway weren't just corrupt. They were running the entire operation. By morning, the leak had spread like wildfire. The press had latched onto it immediately. The scandal too big, too explosive to ignore. When Ezra pulled up to the courthouse, he barely had time to step out of his car before the crowd descended on him. Cameras, reporters, protesters holding signs. Questions flew at him from every direction. Judge Langston, Do you believe the mayor was directly involved? Will Lieutenant Henshaw walk free? What happens next? Ezra ignored them all. Today wasn't about the noise. Today was about justice. Inside the courtroom, Henshaw was already there. He sat at the defense table, his fingers drumming lightly against the wood. His jaw was set, his shoulders squared. But Ezra could see it. The tension, the tightness in his grip, the way his eyes flicked toward the exit every so often. Mayor Holloway? Nowhere to be seen. Figures. The prosecutor didn't waste time. Lieutenant Henshaw, he began, adjusting his glasses. Have you ever accepted bribes in exchange for allowing criminal organizations to operate freely in Baltimore? Henshaw's smirk was automatic. Absolutely not. Ezra said nothing. He'd seen this act before. The confidence, the denial, the belief that he was untouchable. The prosecutor turned toward the judge. Your Honor, the state would like to submit Exhibit C, a recently obtained recording featuring the defendant and Mayor Holloway discussing financial kickbacks from criminal enterprises. The smirk vanished. The courtroom went still. The prosecutor hit play. Ezra didn't watch the room. He watched Henshaw, the twitch in his jaw, the way his hands curled into fists, his lawyer leaning in, whispering urgently. By the time the audio ended, the silence was thick. Henshaw's lawyer jumped in fast. Your Honor, this so-called evidence was obtained illegally? Doesn't change what's on it, the prosecutor cut in. The judge nodded, voice firm. The recording stands. Continue. And then, the doors to the courtroom burst open. Federal agents stormed in. Lieutenant Rick Henshaw, one of them called out, badge flashing, voice steady. You are under arrest for corruption, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Henshaw shot to his feet. This is bullsh. The handcuffs clicked, and just like that, the tension snapped. A wave of voices crashed over the courtroom. Reporters scrambling for phones, cameras flashing, murmurs turning into a roar. Ezra didn't move. He just exhaled. It was over. And Holloway? His time was coming, because by the end of the day, the mayor of Baltimore would be sitting in an interrogation room of his own. Ezra sat at his desk, staring at the city skyline beyond his office window. The morning sun painted Baltimore in hues of gold and orange, but despite its beauty, the weight of everything that had transpired lingered heavy in his chest. It had been weeks since Henshaw was arrested, and the aftershocks of the case were still rippling through the justice system. He should have felt victorious. Instead, he felt something more complicated. His name was everywhere, a symbol of reform, of accountability, of standing up when no one else would. But he knew better than to believe that one battle had won the war. Kendra had published her final piece on the scandal. The article detailed everything: the police corruption, the financial fraud, the ties between the mayor's office and criminal enterprises. It was her most powerful work yet. The fallout had been swift. Henshaw was facing multiple felony charges. The evidence against him was undeniable, and his trial was already shaping up to be one of the most significant police corruption cases in the city's history. Mayor Holloway had resigned, his career in shambles. Investigations into his financial dealings were ongoing, and there was a real chance that he would face federal charges of his own. Noah Velasquez had been released. The charges against him dropped. The DOJ had intervened, ensuring his protection from retaliation. He had risked everything, and though the system had tried to break him, he had emerged stronger. Ezra exhaled, rubbing his temples. It was a victory, but victories in this world were always fleeting. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Warren stepped in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Figured you could use one. Ezra took the cup, nodding his thanks. Any updates? Warren settled into the chair across from him. DOJ is officially launching a full-scale review of the Baltimore Police Department. Internal Affairs is cleaning house. But you know as well as I do, this is just the beginning. Ezra smirked. You sound like me now. Warren shrugged. Spend enough time around you, it's bound to happen. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had fought for pressing down on them. Then Warren asked, if you could go back to that night when those cops pulled you over, would you do anything differently? Ezra looked out the window. Down on the streets below, people moved about their day. some rushing to work, some chatting with neighbors, some carrying signs demanding further police reform. The fight wasn't over, but at least it had begun. He turned back to Warren, a small, knowing smile on his lips. If I didn't stop that night, who would? The weeks that followed were a blur of court proceedings, legislative discussions, and ongoing investigations. The city was changing, slowly, painfully, but it was changing. Kendra had thrown herself into new projects, using her growing platform to expose other injustices beyond Baltimore. She had become more than just a journalist. She was a force of nature, unwilling to let those in power silence the truth. Ezra had been approached by reform groups, by advocacy organizations, by young lawyers looking for mentorship. He had spent decades upholding the law, but now he was helping to change it. And Noah? He was still a cop, but he was a different kind of cop now, one who refused to look the other way. On a crisp fall morning, Ezra walked into Langford's Coffee, the same small cafe where he had spent countless hours thinking, planning, and worrying. This time, he felt different. Lighter. The barista recognized him instantly. "Coffee, Judge Langston?" Ezra chuckled. "You know me too well." He took his cup and sat by the window. Warren joined him a few minutes later, sliding into the seat across from him. They sat in silence for a while, watching the city move around them. Warren eventually spoke. "So what now?" Ezra sipped his coffee, considering the question. "Now," he gestured to the street, to the people, to the world still turning. "Now, we keep going." Ezra stepped out of the cafe, the warmth of the sun hitting his face. He looked down the street, past the crowds, past the traffic, past the noise of the world. A new system wouldn't be built overnight, but it had to start somewhere. And as long as people were willing to fight, he knew that change, real, meaningful change, was possible. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and walked forward, because there was still work to do. Justice isn't just about laws. It's about the people willing to stand up when the system fails. Ezra Langston didn't set out to be a symbol of change, but when faced with injustice, he made a choice: to fight no matter the cost. His story is a reminder that corruption thrives in silence, and sometimes all it takes is one voice refusing to back down. What would you have done in Ezra's place? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more gripping tales of justice, resilience, and change.